I don't know about you, but I'm feeling pretty regal. You should. You should feel expansive with music like that. Thank you so much. I want very much to talk about the spiritual character of our daily personal lives. That's what we're doing this year. Not talking about gods and heavens and Bibles and stuff, although those can be important, but the reality is we live our lives without thinking about those most of the time. It's a question of how you live your life that really is whether or not you have a religion. As I pointed out in a committee meeting, if you belong to Fountain Street Church and then go home and live like every other Lutheran, how much of Fountain Street Church are you? It really should be affecting your life, and I mean in a positive and defining way. I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to talk about your personal relationships, the way I talked about your work and your money last month. That's what I wanted to talk about, and I still will talk about it someday, I'm sure. But instead, because of the constant economic turmoil this month and the turbulence that's injected into all of our lives, I'm going to have to talk not about the spiritual relationships we have with each other as much as the moral relationships we have with each other, because so much of what has been happening is the child of a theory that there is no moral dimension to our shared social or economic life. Because after all, that is the premise of the whole free market neoconservative approach, that we're all free agents with the usual supply of appetites, and that in a free market we will all pursue our individual needs and desires rationally, maximizing profit, minimizing cost, and that it would all somehow balance out, that the marketplace is an efficient place that evens out all the vicissitudes of life, at least economic life. And in this context, of course, moral choices, whether you're doing right or wrong or good or bad, are really immaterial. Because after all, the market blends them all together in a great homogenized equanimity. It all makes sense in the abstract, kind of like the way weather prediction makes sense abstractly. But then suddenly you find yourself in Dulac, and Katrina's coming at you with a 100-year storm, and you're saying, I thought this was supposed to be even out now. No. And this whole notion that the marketplace is an amoral environment, that is, that it doesn't matter whether you do good or bad, right or wrong, because it all works out in the end. This is the question that I want to add to the mix, because I think it is a mistake to assume that we all sit on a level playing field when it comes to making our economic choices about what we buy and what we sell. Oh, we all have the same appetites, whether we're on Wall Street or Main Street. But the difference between the folks in New York or in London and the people who work on the streets of Grand Rapids is the difference between a fellow walking across the street and the fellow driving a car in front of him. He's just one guy. I'm just one guy, but he's wrapped in 3,000 pounds of metal going 30 miles an hour. And whether I bump into his car or he bumps into me, I'm going to come out the worse for it, no matter which way you turn it. In other words, his choice isn't exactly as equal to me as he thinks it is. We are never as equal as we like to think we are. We like to believe we're all equal, but the difference between someone walking across the street and someone cutting in front of them in an automobile is exactly the same sort of difference as someone going to Meijer and someone who runs a hedge fund that buys and sells the commodities at Meijer. Same amount of intelligence in each brain, but the impact of one is different than the impact of the other. We are not equal on the streets, we're not equal in the stores, we're not equal any place in our world, from the interpersonal to the international. One party always has an advantage of power over the other party. And I know this sounds cynical, because one of our most cherished notions, here in America at least, is that we're all equal, right? What is it? As it says in our founding document, that all men are created equal, that government of the people and by the people and for the people, this notion that somehow in America we all are essentially equal. And I think this is a myth that we take part in sometimes, because it feeds the problems that we're having with our economy. It feeds it because it obscures the differences that really do exist and can never be erased. A magazine cartoon I remember, because it's framed on a friend's wall, shows the large father holding the little toddler on his knee, and he's saying, "Let's have a man-to-man talk, son. One large, strong man to one helpless little man." Wouldn't it be nice if that's the way we were more honest with each other? That we recognize that our man-to-man, eye-to-eye, face-to-face encounters were never quite as equal as we'd like to think they are, because that's how life is. Like the pedestrian and the automobile, most encounters are not perfectly eye-to-eye. Parents have power over children. The government has more power than a single citizen. The rich have more power than the poor. And that will always be true, and we can never erase those differences. The problem is that we often act as though everyone in the room is exactly the same, that somehow those differences aren't meaningful, that somehow we are all in America middle class, ordinary, and live in the same neighborhood, when that isn't true. Every encounter in life is what I would like to call asymmetrical. We may not know it, we may not notice it, but it's there. And harm happens not so much when someone lords it over us, but when we forget that those differences are there. That's why we need laws to tell drivers, hey, the person in the crosswalk has the right of way, because if you hurt that person, it will be bad. That's why we have laws that say parents are not allowed to starve their children, even though they have the power to do it. That's why we have laws that say teachers may not hit students, even though they can be royally exasperating. These are never going to be equal encounters, anytime. So we use laws to keep us from exceeding the boundaries we forget are there. Now, this is not news. Think back to those gospel passages. One of them says, "From everyone to whom much is given, much will be required." We all know this. It's called noblesse oblige, or whatever we used to call it, that those who have more in the way of power or influence or money are expected to behave more responsibly than those who have less, not because they're noble, it's because when they act, the outcomes are larger than when others act. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the late Prime Minister of Canada, said that being in Canada next to the United States is like sleeping next to an elephant. Sleeping next to a sleeping elephant. It doesn't matter whether it's awake or asleep, when it rolls over, you still get squashed. So I'm not talking about motivations here. I'm not talking about maliciousness of any kind. I'm saying that when you are more powerful than someone else, whether that be person to person, family to family, business to business, country to country, every motion you make has a ripple effect that's larger than you realize. That's the important premise. Those who have much will be expected to use it humanely. The powerful need to be held to higher standards of accountability. That's why a doctor has to have a license. They have the power of life and death. We must give them licenses and take them away because their power is so great, much greater than a patient. Likewise, the police cannot walk around town brandishing weapons and telling you to pull over. They have rules they must follow, and when they do break them, they must be called to account. And likewise with teachers and others. But you see, most asymmetries are not so visible. Think about your parents. Now, I'm not talking about how your parents were mean to you, but chances are, when you look back on it as grown-ups now, you say, boy, my parents had a profound influence on me. They were stronger, you were weaker, they shaped who you were. Even a benevolent influence is asymmetrical. My son is in his final year of high school. He is trying very hard to meet the standards of his teachers so that he can get good grades and get into a so-called good college. That's power. But there's the other power that he may not acknowledge right now, is that one, two, or more of those teachers will have influenced him in a very positive way, shaped his character, as I know I have experienced. The people who reared me up, my parents and my teachers, shaped the person I am now. Now, this seems very obvious to you, but what happens is we forget which side of the equation we're on. Well, not exactly. We all know when we're on the weak side of that relationship, who's not a little nervous when talking to the doctor or standing before a judge, who doesn't get a little clench in their chest when you look in the rearview mirrors and flashing lights are right behind you. We know when power is about to come into our lives and that we'd better be careful. What we don't notice are the times when we are the powerful one and others are weaker. The best example is that gentleman who abused his power in his automobile by going out of his way to be obscene. Now, that was not because he was just mean, although he was, but he could have chosen just to keep going. But no, he decided, I'll give this guy a hard time because he was bothering me. Well, how can I bother him as a pedestrian? I can't. He abused the power of his vehicle to be thinking we were just a couple of guys and that somehow I had gotten in his way. But there are other places where you and I don't see that we're in the advantage. If you're a straight, white, Anglo male in this country, you're almost always going to have an advantage over someone who's female, gay, or speaks a different language. You may not perceive it. It may not seem like it's there, but believe me, it's there. If you're poor, you always know that the rich have an advantage. If you're a religious minority, you always know that you're outnumbered. These are the asymmetries that will always be there. And this is important for us to notice because if we don't notice these asymmetries, this is where we can come off track morally. Last week I spoke about sin. We don't like it when liberals talk about sin. I just need to remind you that one way or the other we're all imperfect and that we all make bad choices. And while I reject the theory that God is counting up hash marks to see whether or not I deserve to be in heaven or hell, I do affirm that we all screw up, make bad choices that have real outcomes. Liberalism has been ignoring the reality of sin for way too long, and if it wants to be taken seriously as an alternative, it had better deal with the fact that we all make big mistakes. But that's not my point. My point is asymmetry leads us to make sins we don't need to make by forgetting that, hey, I'm the more important person here because I have more power. I have to use it more responsibly. In fact, we tend to think that when we get power, that it's because we deserve it. After all, those guys on Wall Street, they worked hard. They deserve their 6, 7, and 8-figure bonuses because they put in 40, 50, 60 hours a week, unlike the janitors we know who only put in 40, 50, 60 hours a week. You see what I mean? You begin to think after a while that you deserve your power, that it was your right because you were born into the right family, have the right gender, the right sexuality, the right politics, the right religion, or you just happen to be standing there when someone said, hey, I've got a job for you, here's $1 million. We tend to think after a while that we're entitled to the power we have. But that's not the worst sin. The worst sin is forgetting that you have that power altogether. Figuring that somehow you're just like every other person in the street, just like that guy in the automobile. Now, it sounds like virtue. Oh, I'm no better than anybody else. No, I'm no better than anybody else. We're all the same right here. We're all middle-class people here on this planet, here in this neighborhood, here in this town. But by not noticing the advantages all of us have, different though they may be, we forget the added responsibility that comes with having that advantage.